Welcome, everyone, to episode 3 of Sustaining the Herd podcast, brought to you by Agri-Services and Engineering of Raymond, Nebraska. I'm Andrew Wadle, the Director of Innovation and Sustainability at Setchi's. I'm the host of Sustaining the Herd, and I'm here along with our co-host, Brock Vitek.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you today.
And along with Brock and I, we have with us today Lara Moody, the Executive Director at the Institute for Feed Education and Research, otherwise known as iFeeder, which is the research and education arm of the American Feed Industry Association. In a moment, I'm going to introduce Lara, but first, for our new listeners, Sustaining the Herd is a podcast dedicated to all things sustainability in the world of animal agriculture. We believe that animal agriculture is an incredible example of recycling and sustainability and quote unquote no waste. And this is a message that we really like to share with both producers who are so close to the food production process, they sometimes don't know how good a job that they're doing. And we also like to share this message with the non-ag people, or the people in town, as we'd like to say, who are far enough from the process that they know little or nothing about what it takes to sustainably produce food. And feeds and feeding impacts animal agriculture in two ways. On the input side as well as on the output side. And we spend a lot of time at Setchi talking about the output side, that is the manure. In fact, I had a boss one time said that, geez, this manure thing is really just it's a feed problem, not so much a manure problem, but really it's an everything problem. It's something that we all have to be party to solve. So on that note, that I'd like to introduce our guest, Lara Moody, who again is the executive director of iFeeder. And actually, I'm going to have Lara introduce herself, but I would also like to say that I met Lara in 2001 when she and I were part of a program where professional engineers were training professional engineers in Tennessee on how non-ag engineers could serve the needs of producers in Tennessee to do ag work. And so Lara has had a commitment to education and research going back quite a long ways. And so in addition to that, speaking of the output side of animal agriculture, that is on the manure side, Lara in her earlier days, which perhaps she's trying to or hoping to forget, is that Lara did a lot of work, a lot of foundational work on the research on liquid solid separators and manure, both in characterizing the performance, but probably what's had the bigger impact was characterizing or developing the methodologies to sensibly predict performance of these machines. And a lot of those methodologies are still used today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lara to introduce herself and to tell us about iFeeder.
Great. Hey, Brock and Andrew, thanks for having me on today. So glad to represent the Institute for Feed Education and Research here. So as you noted, iFeeder, Research and Education Foundation for the Feed Industry Association in the U.S. Our mission is to advance the trust and understanding of a sustainable animal feed and pet food supply chain through research and education. And, this is the feed industry. You might think, oh, the executive director is an animal nutritionist. But no, as you aptly stated, engineer by training, background, manure management, wastewater treatment, nutrient management issues. And I made my way into the trade association space for the last several years, both in fertilizer and now feed. And so have been advancing agriculture and knowledge of agriculture now in the feed space, and continue to do that as a passion with a focus on the environment. And so the work that iFeeder is doing to support the industry in the sustainability space is, I think, really valuable and adding to what we can do to support our animal ag customers.
Very good. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Lara. I would like to start off with some questions. The first one for you being, why does feed matter in the realm of sustainability in animal agriculture?
Yeah, when we look at the role of feed in animal agriculture, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions or water use or land use change, those are all environmental impacts that we think about around animal agriculture. And feed is a significant piece for each of those. So if we look at the feed's contribution to the global greenhouse gas emissions for livestock. So overall, 41% of livestock's global greenhouse gas emissions are linked to feed. 98% of livestock's freshwater use is linked to feed, and globally, 65% is linked to land use change. And so all three of those are areas that are gaining increased attention in the animal ag industry, especially by their downstream customers. And so we are trying to support our customers, right, the livestock producers themselves, in how we can help them reduce that impact, those impacts around water, land use, and greenhouse gas emissions. When we think about the role that feed can have in reducing those environmental impacts, I tend to think of there being kind of three key ways. So one of those is the impact we can have relative to feedstuff production. So that's the practices that we do on the farm, to think about them as the conservation practices we implement on the farm around soil health or regenerative ag, things to reduce fertilizer use, precision ag, right? Cover crops, all those things we can do around feedstuff production. The second area is around ration innovation. So things that we do in the feed industry relative to ingredients or diet formulations. And then the third area is around circularity. So within the feed industry, over 40% of the ingredients we feed come from other industries. They're waste products from other industries or co-products from other industries. And so thinking about how we can continue to reduce waste from other industries and bring them back into the animal chain where they're used as an energy product or an important ingredient, that's valuable to us. So feedstuff production, ration innovation, and circularity, those are kind of the three areas that we can work on relative to reducing the environmental impact of feed.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And so then within maybe each of those three areas, what are you seeing in terms of advances, or where are we making progress, or maybe where are there opportunities for progress?
Right. So when we think about feedstuff production, that area, there's a lot of focus. That tends to be the area where people focus, right? So when people are particularly thinking about how we reduce the greenhouse gas footprint of animal agriculture, they oftentimes go straight to corn and soybean production, right? That's the feedstuff production side. And that's because there's such a huge opportunity around carbon sequestration. The challenge for those of us that have worked in the ag conservation space for a long time understand is that the trajectory of implementation around things like cover crops is pretty long. And so while there's a huge opportunity there, it's going to take a very long time to get all the acres that are needed or desired into cover crops, or all the acres that are needed or desired with the highest level of precision ag on them, so that we can reduce fertilizer inputs as much as possible. So that is going to continue to happen. There are lots of opportunities there, but the trajectory for implementation and adoption of those practices is long. And so one way we'll continue, very important way, we'll continue to work there. People will continue to work there, but that's going to take some time. Then we have circularity. And so for over 100 years now, we've been feeding a variety of feed ingredients that are waste products, or people think of them as waste products, but we'll call them co-products or byproducts, right? Think of the stuff like distillers' grains, right, that are the result of ethanol processes, or the increased number of crushing plants that are coming online right now because of the interest in aviation fuel or biofuels, right? So more soybean meals coming available. But then there's all kinds of other products like whey protein that we feed back, or whey that we feed back in, almond hulls, right? There's just a variety of things that we feed in the feed industry that can help us reduce waste. So that's the circularity standpoint. And again, we're going to continue. There's a lot of products we're using, but we're continually looking for new products, right, that we can bring in as a feed ingredient. The third area, and I think the area that I see the most opportunity and is exciting to me, is the ration innovation space. And when we think about ration innovation, we're talking about all of the feed ingredients that can help us improve, say, feed conversion efficiency, or help us improve average daily gain for the animals. Because any work that we can do, any feed ingredient that we can provide that helps us do that, then helps us reduce the total amount of feed that we have to provide, or it reduces the amount of time the animal needs to be in the house. And in fact, there's an interesting report that came out last fall. The FAO produced this report, and the FAO's report, and I'll just give you the name of it. Somebody can look it up if they're interested. It's called The Pathways Toward Lower Emissions, a global assessment of greenhouse gas emission and mitigation options from livestock agri-food systems. And so when we think about the role that feed can have, there's this great chart that's within that report. And it basically identifies all the potential ways that we could reduce the footprint of animal agriculture relative to greenhouse gas emissions. And in that space, there's 4 areas that are linked to feed. And those 4 areas would be our ability to increase productivity, right? That's definitely something we do in the feed space relative to animal ag. We can manipulate the rumen. We can directly provide nutritional improvements for the animals. And then we can improve animal health with feed. So all 4 of those things combined, the FAO reports indicates an opportunity for about a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions if we do all of those things. And so when you think about the opportunity then there that lies with ration innovation or circularity and feedstuff production, it's pretty significant, and we have a real opportunity to reduce the footprint there.
Yeah, interesting. And just a follow up to that in the matter of circularity. It would just be interesting to know of all the other potential feed ingredients out there, what do you see as being like, is there something untapped that you'd say, wow, this could, if we could get this into the animal feed supply, this could really move the needle?
So one of the things that a place that a lot of people are looking at right now are actual food waste. So it's one thing to think about food waste that, let's think about bakery waste. So you've got like a very specific manufacturing process. Bakeries, they have a specific handling they do with bakery waste. We know a lot about the consistency of those bakery waste. We know how they were handled. And so they come into the feed chain. Like that's pretty normal that they come in. But when we think about food waste or food scraps, so think about like restaurant scraps, or right, there's some campaigns to try and collect food waste from neighborhoods that they could go back into the feed chain. Well, now you're introducing a lot more complexities and unknowns into the system. And so there are a lot of folks right now thinking about how do we take feed waste, how do we actually use, how do we hydrolyze them, which would be a component of anaerobic digestion. So how do we hydrolyze those and then make them a consistent product and make them I would say consistent and safe and a consistent set of known ingredients product that can be used. So food waste is a big area that people are thinking about, and how do we bring those more into the system? But, periodically I get phone calls, and I just had one a couple of weeks ago from a gal who represents the food and beverage industry and is trying to find uses for their waste products. So I think there's continual interest in people trying to find ways to not send things to the landfill, no matter what the ingredient is.
Very good. Very good.
Very interesting. Laura, as we think about feedstuff production, ration innovation, and circularity, I'd like to pivot a bit from that and think about, okay, so the feed's been produced, procured, and delivered to the livestock production facility. Now we need to use that to create a value-added product by feeding it to an animal. I'm curious, could you help us understand how feed efficiency has changed, presumably improved over time, and how we have gotten to this point?
Yeah. So one of the things that iFeeder has done in the last couple of years is develop a sustainability roadmap for the industry, really a sustainability roadmap for iFeeder. So how do we help support the industry in their sustainability journey, both internally, and how do we help them support their customers in the food value chain? We just wrapped up a project. Actually, we're just wrapping up a project. So in some ways, you're getting like a glimpse into some of the results that really aren't available yet, but we're working on turning that resource into what's going to become available over the next month or so. So one of the things we have is the Animal Food Industry Sustainability Toolkit. It's a toolkit that's available to all animal feed industry members that helps them understand some of the background of sustainability, where opportunities are, where they should start the process. And so we're continually adding resources to that. One of the resources we're adding is this mapping of how we think about animal performance metrics like feed conversion efficiency, like average daily gain. How do we think about those relative to their role in reducing the environmental footprint? So, right, we as a feed industry have been really great about measuring feed conversion efficiency or average daily gain or reduced mortality. Like, we do that well because that's how we sell products, right? So if an animal producer is going to decide to utilize a new ingredient in that space, they want to make sure it's going to pay for itself, right? And so that's how measuring those performance metrics is how we show them the value that they can have by feeding them. So we've been interested in how do you actually link then those performance metrics like feed conversion efficiency to an actual reduction. And so I'm going to give you some examples. So one of the things that is coming out in our toolkit is not available yet, but it's coming out, is a lit review and kind of a mapping of the literature that we found. And so we basically looked at a series of what we would say are ration innovations, like, and this is just a start. So we looked at 6 of them. There's way more out there. We looked at formula optimization. We looked at eubiotics, which means prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics. We looked at enzymes. We looked at amino acids. We looked at the use of proteins, and we looked at the use of lipids. And so here's just some examples. So in literature, there was a study that said feeding probiotic or eubiotic blends of essential oils. So feeding essential oils along with vitamin D3 improved net energy utilization by 3 to 4% and increased the gain to feed ratio. So if we improve feed efficiency, that can lead to fewer tons of feed per pound of body weight gain, right? So that has a very measurable, like if we can feed less feed, that's a very measurable footprint reduction. There was another study that looked at the use of probiotics. So if we can, the study was health benefits relative to health benefits and efficiency benefits of feeding prebiotics. And so they found that if we feed prebiotics, and this is all, I should say, these are related to beef. So I pulled examples from beef, that we could reduce morbidity by 46%. Well, if we reduce morbidity in beef by 46%, that clearly has a footprint improvement, right? Because we're getting more pounds out of the inputs that we're putting in. Another one looked at feeding fat supplements in different forms on the ability to improve performance and to reduce methane emissions from grazing beef cattle. So grazing beef cattle is really important because it's very hard to get things into them versus cattle that we have in feed yards. But basically, by using fat supplements, the study showed that you could get a 12% reduction from feeding lipids. And so again, there's a place where we have the ability to directly reduce methane emissions. And all of those are ration innovations that are coming along. Those are things that we have animal performance metrics for. And now we know theoretically there are ways they can reduce the footprint, but we haven't calculated them yet. And so actually, our next task within iFeeder is documenting a methodology and standardizing it for that purpose.
Very interesting. Sounds like a toolkit that provide a lot of value to livestock producers in their operations. I'm curious, Laura, as we look at the environmental sustainability, clearly some opportunities to be more resource efficient. Could you help us understand a little more how this also leads to greater economic sustainability? If you're maybe needing to purchase or produce a few less tons of feed for that same gain, there can be some economic gains for a producer too. So could you talk about that a little bit as well?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, we can talk about the ability to reduce the tons of feed that we feed an animal. But when we're talking about production systems, and I think particularly poultry and swine production systems, right? There you're talking about housed animals that have energy requirements each day, have water requirements each day, produce more manure each day, which requires a volume to contain that. And so if we can reduce the number of days that an animal is within that production system because we're improving average daily gain or something like that, that is a way that we get, it has a environmental footprint reduction, but it also has a dollar value tied to it, right? Less energy, less light, less water, less feed, right? Similarly, when we're thinking about pen spacing, when we're thinking about now, think about a feed yard or a dairy system, right? In a feed yard, if we can turn animals over in that system sooner, right, then we're putting more animals in that system through the year, which again then brings down the operation cost of that facility. And so I think in many cases, people hear the term sustainability, and this is in the feed industry. This is, I think, everywhere. There's a fear of the word sustainability, and so I'm actually cautious to use it at different times. But at its heart, sustainability is about risk management. And so if we understand what issues are important to us, and if it's the economics, if it's the animal health, if it's the amount of feed we use, if it's the amount of energy we have to use, whatever it may be, if we understand the risks that are important to us, sustainability is about understanding those risks and doing something about it. That oftentimes means measuring it, which is what people associate with sustainability. But it's only when we measure those risks or measure the impacts we're having by making change that we can then, understand where we are in that system and reduce those risks. And so the economic piece is just as important as the environmental footprint piece, and they are oftentimes very much tied together.
Certainly, it's a multifaceted approach for sure. Thank you.
So Laura, one of the things that you don't have to listen to the news too long or to read the paper too long, and you hear the buzzwords of greenhouse gas emissions, GHGs, et cetera. And you kind of alluded to it earlier that animal agriculture, and you could say agriculture in general, is really implicated as being a bad actor in this area. And so what role does animal agriculture play in your view in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and what can feed and feeding do to reduce the impact? And I'm even going to say what's being done today, and clean off your crystal ball and look in there and see what could you see coming down the road.
Well, when we look at animal agriculture and greenhouse gas emissions, there's three greenhouse gases that we're talking about. We're talking about carbon dioxide, we're talking about methane, and we're talking about nitrous oxide. Carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide are generally linked to the feedstuff production side. Carbon dioxide, and anytime we till, anytime we do something to disturb the soil, like we're releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's why cover crops and no-till are so important to that space. Nitrous oxide, because anytime we're using fertilizer, or even if we're applying manure, even if we're using manure nutrients, right, the microbiome of the soil are modifying the form of nitrogen that exists in the soil, and we end up letting nitrous oxide off. We also generate a lot of CO2 in the fertilizer production process when we're talking about commercial fertilizers. So there are greenhouse gases tied to the feedstuff production, right, when we grow the corn and the soybean. And then from a methane side, we end up with methane tied to enteric emissions from our ruminant animals, sheep, goat, dairy, and beef cows. And then we also have methane emissions that come off on the manure side. And so there are certainly folks. So then how do we address that? Well, let's say this. Let's be a little more clear about the numbers. So when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, the FAO, which I like to use as a reference because it's at least one clear identifiable reference, the FAO would indicate that 42 to 78% of greenhouse gas emissions are tied to feed. And why that variability? That's because ruminants, beef and dairy cows, a significant piece of their greenhouse gas emissions are tied to enteric. So it drives down the percentage, right? It offsets the percentage of feed. So about 42% of greenhouse gas emissions for dairy and beef come from feed, and about 45% come from enteric emissions. And then for the monogastrics, for pork and poultry, because they don't have that enteric piece, that's why a bigger fraction of their greenhouse gas emissions are tied to feed. So when we consider that, then where do we have opportunities, right? Clearly, the feedstuff production side, right? Go back to what I said in the beginning. There's lots of opportunity on the feedstuff production side, right? The ability to implement conservation practices. The challenge is the trajectory is long. So is there something we can do in the short term to reduce that? Well, the way we achieve that in the short term is we work on ration innovation. So if we can feed less corn, then if you follow that through the system, right, there's less CO2 being emitted because we're feeding less, or for the animal, because we're feeding less of the material. And so even though the trajectory is long for the implementation of conservation practices, there are things we can do to feed less corn and soy that allow us to reduce the footprint that way. On the enteric emissions side, there is a lot of work underway, looking at things like seaweed, looking at things that we already have in the system, like monensin, looking at lipids and tannins, right? Those are things that we can do to reduce enteric emission in the ruminant animals. There are other products that are being used in other countries that we know are available. We know they're coming to the U.S., something like 3-NOP, which everybody is eagerly awaiting for here in the U.S. On that side of the equation, my good friends at the American Feed Industry Association are doing a lot to work with the FDA to improve the regulatory process, improve the labeling process, so that we can bring more of those products to bear and to market as research improves on them. So there's definitely work happening in that space. And then we also have ingredients that are aimed in it reducing, say, nitrogen and phosphorus, right, that is excreted by the animal. And so there's a variety of things that we're doing to work on reducing the footprint, and in particular, greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah, very good. And as being involved in the anaerobic digester space as we are, we'll be eagerly waiting to see what that looks like in terms of how it affects manure production, because a lot of producers are doing quite well in the area of selling renewable natural gas, and so it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting area that there is not enough research in yet, right? Relative to how some of these new feed ingredients that we know impact methane production within the animal equate to methane production in a digester of the animal's manure. So I think, to me, I'm not working in that space anymore, but I find it fascinating, and I'm be interested to see what the research evolves there.
Well, when we have you back for Sustaining the Herd episode number 103, hopefully we'll be able to talk about that.
Yeah.
Laura, as we think about the impact of GHG emissions, I'd like to think of an applied case of that. We hear a lot about this carbon discussion these days in agriculture. So could you tell us, what role is the carbon discussion, especially carbon intensity and CI scoring, playing in the feed industry today?
Yeah, let's start with some definitions. All right. So in the carbon space, you'll hear people talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 emissions, so scope 1 carbon is anything that is within the facility or the organization's direct control. So let's give an example. Let's think of Tyson or Smithfield, right? So their scope 1 emissions are everything that they have within their direct control within their processing facilities. Scope 2 emissions are anything linked to the energy they use within their facility. So if they're generating steam, or they're using bringing electricity in, or they're burning natural gas, right? Any emissions tied to energy, that's scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions are everything else that's part of their value chain, right? It's part of their supply chain. So animal production and thereby feed are part of the scope 3 emissions for many downstream customers of ours. I would say many folks downstream of us in the value chain. And those folks that are downstream of us in the value chain are generally are much closer to the consumer, right? And also a lot of them are publicly traded, multinational, global companies. So there are a lot of those organizations, and I'll give you a list, that have set these goals, right? So I can tell you, here's some examples. So Pepsi, JBS, Walmart, Tyson, Nestle, all of those companies have set goals to be at net zero on carbon by either 2030 or 2040. Because they've set those goals, now people are paying attention to them and wondering if they're acting on them, wondering if they're starting to make movements toward achieving them, wondering if they have a roadmap in place for a plan for how they're going to achieve them. So because those companies began to focus on carbon as part of their goals, one of the things they started doing was an analysis of where most of their carbon was, right? Was it scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3? And if it is scope 3, where was it sitting within that? And feed rapidly starts to come to the surface as one of the key components of where their carbon is coming from. And so those closer to the consumer-facing companies are starting to think about how they can reduce their emissions and what they can do in the feed space. And so that's really, I think, what's driving the animal ag chain to pay attention and the feed chain to pay attention. The other place that you see movement around carbon scoring, so we call it, it's not quite the same, but close. You'll hear people talk about life cycle assessments. And so life cycle assessments can include global warming potential or carbon, as well as many other impacts. And so a lot of the animal organizations, so think about DMI, for dairy, or the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, or the American Egg Board, or National Pork Board, like all of those folks are doing life cycle assessments across their production systems in the U.S. so that they can understand themselves what their carbon footprints are looking like, where the hotspots are, and then where they should be targeting their research dollars, right, to be able to reduce those impacts. And so again, that oftentimes brings us back to feed and manure as well. You all don't get out of it.
Very good.
Lara, before we let you go, we'd like to offer something up to our traditional non-ag listeners, for what we kind of like to call our people in town segment. One of my messages for the people in town is always that agriculture was big into recycling and sustainability before recycling and sustainability were even cool. We've been doing this for a long time. It's just that we're getting better and better and better at it. So before we go, is there anything in the realm of feed and feeding and research and everything that you do that a person in town would say, that's really cool, I didn't know that, or something they'd go tell a friend about, just so that we can continue to tell a great message about agriculture and animal agriculture?
Yeah. Number one, here's an interesting point. So one of the things iFeeder supports is something called the Clear Center. And the Clear Center is located at UC Davis, and Dr. Frank Mitlerner is a expert in the space of environmental impacts of animal agriculture. And one of the questions we always get asked is, why don't we just reduce the amount of protein consumption we have? Why don't we just reduce the amount of animals that we're producing? And the fact is that within the U.S., he has in a presentation I heard him give recently, 98% of U.S. households have, even if they're vegetarian, have some form of animal protein in them, right? Because it's probably eggs or milk. And so here we have within the U.S. population, 98% of the U.S. population is likely to have some type of animal protein in it, right? So that means that our ability, the interest in the American population of what we can do to help reduce the footprint of animal agriculture through feed, right, is important. And second, as you mentioned, like we've been thinking about recycling in the animal ag and livestock space forever, right? Because initially we didn't have commercial fertilizers. Like our fertilizer source were manures, right? That came from animal agriculture. And so animals continue to be a key piece of our ability to recycle nutrients and recycle within the supply chain. When we think about circularity, then, which circularity is really about closing the loop on places that we have loss, animal agriculture is just like so key to that. There are areas of land that we can't use for arable production. And the only thing we can do on that land useful is, maybe go out for a hike or a run, but graze animals on it, right? And so there is a resource, right? The ability to graze animals. Like we could not get the potential from that land any other way than to have ruminants like graze on it, because nobody else can eat the grass that grows on that. And so again, their ruminants are like a key piece for us. Similarly, when we start thinking about other things that are inedible, right? I don't like people munch on their almonds, but nobody's munching on almond hulls. People are happy to drink their orange juice, but nobody wants to eat a big like spoonful of citrus pulp. And so again, there are all these products out there that we wouldn't otherwise use. They would just go to the landfill or be disposed of some other way that the animal industry utilizes. And so I think that for folks that, recognizing the role, the importance of animal protein in their own diets, and then the things that we are bringing into animal agriculture to help feed animals, I think is really something that people probably don't realize, and how important they are to the recycling of things that we can't use ourselves.
Yeah, that's a fantastic illustration. The almond hulls and the almonds and the orange peels and the oranges. That's a great illustration of how we'll say the people in town and animal agriculture interact without even really knowing about it.
Yeah. And I would just mention one more thing, because people may, if anything I mentioned today is of interest to folks, you can check out iFeeder at ifeeder.org. We have blogs. So some of the things I was talking about relative to the FAO report, there's a blog on that report. There is a newsletter that we have. The toolkit that I mentioned is on the website if you're interested in that. The new resources that I talked about coming out, where we have mapped out like the linkage between ration innovation to performance metrics, that'll be coming out in the next couple of months. And so all of that you can find at ifeeder.org.
That's great. Well, Lara, I'd like to officially welcome you to the herd. You are now part of the herd, and are Sustaining the Herd podcast. And I really appreciate it. It's a fantastic discussion. On behalf of my co-host, Brock, we would like to really thank you. And for our listeners, join us next time when Brock and I will be broadcasting from the American Biogas Council's Biogas Americas Conference, and we'll be discussing the latest advancements and news in the world of producing renewable natural gas from manure. Thanks for listening.